welcome to tonight's show. Before we get into it, I came into the studio and my friend Jim Bell had me a hat that I had to wear, and I just wanted everybody to take a look at it. Maybe I should start this program off as maybe saying the Gettysburg Address or something, I don't know. But right now I'd like to introduce our guest. I don't think I have to say for the Confederate, we have Sergeant Hall. Sergeant Hall, welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir.
And for the Union, we have Sergeant Hughes. Sergeant, welcome to the show. I'm glad I got both sergeants on and no officers, so you all equal rank, I see.
I'm one stripe ahead of him.
One stripe ahead of him, okay. If you have any questions, please call 227-4480. I'm curious to know if any of our listeners are listening, how they really feel about the Civil War, how it ended, maybe what people thinking if the South has won the war, what would it be like today? I see Sergeant Hughes giving me a dirty look over here for saying that. So gentlemen, I'm going to ask you all to just go ahead and do your little things that you do, and let's get the show started that way.
Well, we've been asked to come talk to you folks tonight about this conflict we've been involved in the last few years. And of course, some folks been referring to it as American Civil War, and some folks been referring to it as a
What is that
between
thing
the states.
anyway?
I don't know, some kind of a bug.
Is this thing I got over here loaded anyway? What you got crawling around?
We got that.
I always knew that rebels had bugs all over them.
We're trying to get the sound here for the Confederates starting.
You're not missing a whole lot, ladies and gentlemen.
Appreciate it. Like I say, some folks have been asking us.
Maybe if we just have the on the outside.
How about that?
That'll do it. Well, like I
Now
said,
you can tell them your lies.
some folks have been talking about this war as the war between the states, and some folks have been calling it the Civil War. Really, I reckon it depends on your own point of view, because folks I've been running around with have been referring to it as the war of Yankee aggression. At any rate, this thing started back in '61, much as a result of an institution referred to as slavery. Of course, now slavery wasn't anything new. It'd been around for well nigh 400 years. It was back about 1441 that some Portuguese sailors first visited the west coast of Africa, and they found something there they'd never seen before, and that was folks with black skin. And they took a few of them to Lisbon, Portugal, and displayed them in front of the king as kind of like strange beings from a foreign world. But what really got it rolling, though, was, I reckon, was a discovery by a fellow named Columbus. See, old Columbus discovered the New World, and once he had done so...
You start way back, don't you?
Well, once old Columbus had discovered this place, you see, a lot of folks would be wanting to move to it. Of course, it cost them a lot of money to do so. They had to book passage on a ship and buy seeds for crops and tools to plant the crops and tools to build their homes and things. And by the time they finished with all this, they just didn't have much money left, you see, to pay for labor. Of course, the answer to the problem was slave labor. And I'm not going to stand up here and try to argue the rights and wrongs of slavery. You see, I got enough sense to leave that up to the politicians. Of course, now if you folks realize politicians the way I do, you realize that they talk a lot about things, but they rarely settle things.
Well, now that the North and South can agree on.
No doubt. Anyway, the politicians come to our rescue about 1820 with what they call a political compromise. They call it the Missouri Compromise, which admitted Missouri as a slave state, and of course Maine come in as a free state. There's, of course, balance of power in the House and the Senate. Anyway, people's tempers started getting hot about the middle of the 1840s, so once again our politicians come to our rescue with another political compromise. And this time they called it the Kansas and Nebraska Acts. Of course, it calmed people down for a while, but by 1850, this temper started getting hot again, so...
Mainly southern tempers.
There's a lot of northern tempers.
A hot-tempered breed, you know that? I think that's a basic problem that's behind all this. You're just out of control down there. But go on, tell them some more of your lies. And...
Anyway, like I said, in 1850, our politicians come to our rescue one more time. This time they call it the Compromise of 1850, written by Henry Clay. Well, it cooled people's tempers off for a while, but by 1860, they started getting hot once more, you see, on account of the fact there was a big presidential election that year. Of course, now there was actually 4 candidates running for the office of president that year. A fellow that won the state of Kentucky, his name was John Bell.
I voted for him.
Did you, sir?
I did.
Well, of course, his party affiliation was known as the Constitutional Union Party. They believed in the Constitution and they believed in the Union, but they really didn't address the other issues involved in the election. Not only slavery, but land reforms and tariffs and things. Of course, now the biggest party involved in the election of '60 was the Democrats. They'd all gotten together down in Charleston, South Carolina that summer and tried to decide who they was going to have as a presidential candidate, but, well, time they got down there, they found them mostly acting like a bunch of politicians and arguing about things without settling too much or nothing, and some folks got so hot they just bolted from the convention entirely. And they decided they'd meet...
I was that far south, I'd bolt too, I think.
They decided they'd meet 2 months later in Baltimore. By the time they got there, they found the tempers hadn't cooled off at all, and once more, what they call the radical Southerners would bolt from that convention. And these folks would be the ones that would support John C. Breckinridge out of Kentucky for that office that year.
There's a traitor.
Of course, now the other half of that party would support a fellow out of Illinois. His name was Stephen Douglas. But you see, the Democratic Party was the biggest party involved in that election, but since they were split right down the middle into two factions, it opened the door wide open for the Republican Party to sneak in and capture that election. Of course, their candidate was a big old tall fellow out of Illinois, kind of looked like a gorilla. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Anyway, a lot of folks in the South didn't think too much of this Lincoln fella. He and his Republican Party were dedicated to limiting the spread of slavery into the newly occupied territories. Talking about Arizona, New Mexico, and such. Of course, a lot of folks down south had made a lot of money off slavery, and they, of course, wanted to see it expand. So the whole thing comes down to the fact that on one hand, you got a political party trying to limit the spread of slavery, and on the other hand, you got a group with economic power trying to spread it. Of course, you can't spread it and limit it at the same time, so something had to give. Something gave, all right, and what it was with the Union itself.
Pack of traitors. Pack of traitors. Now, before you go a lot farther on this, I want to straighten you out a little bit about your slavery issue. Now, I'm a Kentucky soldier. You can go through the ranks of just about every Kentucky regiment in the United States Army, and you'll find it very difficult to find a soldier from Kentucky who is fighting to free the slaves. What we fight for is the Union, for the Constitution, to keep the country as one country, not to free the slaves. Now, you go right on and tell them the rest of your story.
I hate to disillusion you there, Billy, but you see, most of the folks I was with didn't fight for slavery neither. You see, it all boils down to back '76 when the folks here in this country revolted against King George. You see, they wouldn't get no representation. They're being taxed without being represented and all, and they felt that old King George wasn't being good to their needs and things, so they decided to revolt against him. Of course, old King George didn't like that too much, and they brought on the Revolutionary War. But you see, in 1860, the same thing was coming up. You see, the southern states felt that the northern government up in Washington was being unresponsive to their needs, and they figured, well, if they voted to get into this here union, they might as well vote to get themselves out of it.
And they voted to get in and stay in.
Well, they didn't see it that way.
That's why we're fighting the war.
Well, you see, old Lincoln, he says that the idea of secession was unconstitutional, but I tell you what you do, Billy. You go right up to that president of yours, you ask him to point out in that Constitution just exactly where it says anything at all about secession, let alone it being illegal.
That's right. It doesn't say anything in there about it. You can't leave.
Well, that's my point. It don't say nothing at all about it, you see. Of course, that Lincoln fella said it was in there, and I reckon a lot of you Billies must have believed him because there's so many of you in the field.
Not all of us voted for it. Now, here's your point. We can sit here and we can argue this all night, but we can't decide this sitting here arguing it, you and me. If we could, there wouldn't be any need for this war. That right there is what that war is all about. So go ahead and tell them what's been going on in the war, because we're not going to settle that issue unless I shoot you, which I might do before the night's over. Anybody that'd like to see me shoot him, call in right now.
Well, there's two sides to a gun barrel, Billy. I got one too, you see. Anyway, this thing got started back in December 20th of 1860, because it was then that the folks in South Carolina passed what they called an ordinance of secession. Basically, all that really means was they'd simply rescinded the ratification of the Constitution. At any rate, a lot of folks jumped on this here secession wagon, folks from Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, Florida, Texas, Louisiana. They sent the delegates down to Montgomery, Alabama, and it was there that they created what they called the Confederate States of America.
Let's take this call right here, right now. Let's see what this is. Just remember right where you were. Yes, go ahead.
I wanted to see the rebels shoot the Yankee, not the Yankee, the rebel.
You want to...
Thank you, ma'am. I very much appreciate that.
That's score 1 for the South.
Who's keeping count?
Okay, go ahead.
Well, like I say, this Lincoln fella up here in Washington, he didn't believe in this idea of secession. He said it was unconstitutional. At any rate, folks down south figured they had a good right to do so, you see. Anyway, things started getting hot once again down in South Carolina around the middle of April. See, there was only natural for the folks in the South to want to occupy and possess all the lands within the Confederacy. They occupied and possessed most of them, except there's this big old rock out in the middle of Charleston Harbor. The Yankees was sitting on it, and of course that was Fort Sumter.
Stop right there on the rock, and we'll see.
I'd like to see you on a rock.
Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to see that Billy shoot that rebel.
You want
Thank
to
you,
see
ma'am.
the Billy shoot the rebel?
That's right.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right.
Mark that.
That's
ma'am.
1 and 1. Okay.
We'll take a survey here.
Now the Yankees were sitting on the rocks. What?
Well, you see, we asked them kind of to leave, but they didn't want to. What they required was a little bit of persuasion. Well, starting on the 12th day of April, we started persuading them, and it took 48 hours of persuading before they finally run down that flag.
They were tough. You know, the Colonel Anderson that was commanding at Fort Sumter, Major Anderson then, got to be general later on. He was from Kentucky, right over in Louisville. Did you know that?
I knew that. Of course, I can't hold that against him.
Keep talking. You're doing so well. It's so great to be able to come and hear what we're fighting this war about.
Anyway, after the Yankees done left Fort Sumter, Mr. Lincoln then called forth an issue for 75,000 militia troops to put down in this here rebellion, as he called it. Of course, he had his Secretary of War, Mr. Cameron, then send out telegrams to the governors of all the loyal states to inform them of what their troop quotas would be. But I tell you, I'd sure like to have been there when that old Abe Lincoln opened up that telegram from Kentucky's Governor, Uriah McGoffin. He opened it up and read that Kentucky furnished no troops whatsoever for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister southern states. Of course, now
Mr. McGoffin is no longer governor, you'll observe.
Of course, now the folks over in Arkansas and Tennessee and North Carolina and Virginia, they were so outraged by this Lincoln fella's call for troops that they too passed ordinances of secession, and they soon joined the newly formed Confederacy, which then moved its capital over to Richmond, Virginia. Well, Kentucky's part in all this was kind of precarious. You see, all the states that had remained loyal to the Union were north of the Kentucky line, whereas all the states seceding from that Union were south of the Kentucky line. So Kentucky was kind of pulled in between both of them, you see. Folks over in eastern Kentucky was kind of tied to the north on account of newly opened railroads and things, but there were no railroads in western Kentucky, and these folks, of course, depended on the river systems to transport their goods down to New Orleans. Of course, then these folks had their sentiments with the South. And it was right hard for Kentuckians to make up their minds.
You got families pulling both ways,
yeah, well,
too.
look at John J. Crittenden. Of course, he was Kentucky's senator at this time. And he had two sons, Thomas and George, and each one of them were generals in the Army. One of them was in the Yankee Army, and one of them was in the Confederate Army. And I come from over in Woodford County, and there was a family over there named Buford, and there was 9 boys in that family, and 4 of them fought with the Yankees, and 5 of them fought with the Confederacy. As one old boy in my brigade told me, he said, if war comes to Kentucky, he said he would fight with Kentucky. So if Kentucky was split up, he would fight with his region of the state. He said if his region of the state was split up, he'd fight with his home county. And he said if his home county was split up, he said he'd fight with his hometown. And he said worst comes to worst, he said if his hometown was split up, well, he said he'd fight with his side of the street.
I got a story. I forgot what battle it was in, but 2 of the Kentucky regiments, one Union, one Confederate, were facing each other, firing away at each other. They came in close. It was hand-to-hand fighting. Some of the Confederates were captured. And turned out that one of the loyal Union soldiers discovered his father was in the ranks of the men they had captured from the Confederate Kentucky unit. And they talked a while, and then the battle started up again, and the Union soldier went to run back into the line to fire back at the Confederate troops. And his brother came up and said, you can't do that. He said, why not? He says, our father's over there in that other line. Now that's how Kentucky gets to split up in this war.
Well, it was right hard for Kentuckians. As time was coming, though, they had to make their minds up, you see, because it was early November of 1861 that Confederate forces under General Polk come into the state and occupied.
Oh, here's one of the great military geniuses of the South, the Bishop General Leonidas Polk. Why don't you tell them what a great military genius you have here? Here's Kentucky, neutral, a barrier between the North and the South. Great advantage to the South, who's weaker. They got plenty of time to build up their army. What does Polk do? Marches into Kentucky, Neutrality ends. Union Army comes into Kentucky. There's a great military genius.
Well, you see, the reason General Polk come into the state was because that daggone Yankee General Nelson, I believe his name was recruiting over in Garrett.
Well, that's not marching in an army and building forts.
If you recruiting billies and you put them in the blue uniform, you see, they've done been made Yankees, and I don't care what you call them, they're still Yankees.
But they're Kentuckians on
That don't
Kentucky
matter.
soil.
I mean, so a lot of the folks that come in with Columbus were Kentuckians too.
Yeah, but a lot of them weren't.
Well, anyway, old General Polk, he realized that if he put some cannons on top of the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, he could, of course, control all the traffic on that river. Well, plant them guns he did, over 140 of them, and they soon started calling it the Gibraltar of the West. They swore them down, you
Mighty
Yankees would
fortress.
never take the place by storm, and you never
He
did.
didn't have to. He marched out.
Of course, the next day, that Yankee General Grant occupied a place called Paducah, Kentucky, and like I say, although Kentucky had maintained its neutrality throughout the summer of '61, it had now been violated by both sides, and recruitment camps come in as well as regular forces. The Confederates come in and they established what they call a defensive line in Kentucky, and it ran from Cumberland Gap on through Monticello, Kentucky, on over to Bowling Green, and it dropped down a little bit to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland, and Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, and then on back up to Columbus.
Powerful defensive line.
Well, you folks got to realize, you see, Confederate forces didn't want to start no war. They just wanted to be left alone.
No, they just left the Union and formed an army. And no, they don't want to start a war.
Well, they didn't. They just wanted to be left alone to go in peace. It was up to you Yankees to fight what you might call an offensive war. Of course, it shouldn't have been too hard for you, because there ain't nothing as offensive as a Yankee in the first place.
I can only think of one thing.
At any rate, the first time they hit us was at a place called Mill Springs in January of '62. It was a cold, wet day in January, and most of our boys was armed with these old flintlocks and smoothbore shotguns, much like what old Daniel Boone had when he come across the mountains.
Yeah, you're gonna tell them about your second great Confederate military genius now, aren't you? General Wrongway Felix Zollicoffer.
Well, I think what this bill is referring to was the fact that old General Zollicoffer was in charge of the right side of the Confederate line, and of course, he was a real nice general, well liked by his troops and all. Just one problem, you see, he was nearsighted. Couldn't see too good.
Well, that's I don't fault him for that problem.
Well, while the battle was going on, he realized that there was a regiment, a gray-clad regiment on the hill that was firing into his troops, you see, and he figured somehow his orders had gotten messed up, and somehow one of his body of men was fighting into another body, and, well, he jumped on his horse and went over and told the colonel of that regiment to cease firing immediately. But they turned out to be gray-clad Yankee troops, and the colonel pulled his pistol out and put a bullet right through Zollicoffer's heart. Made the first general to die in battle here in Kentucky.
Let's take this call. Stop right there. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to know from each one of them where they think their best battles were fought here in Kentucky.
Okay. Where do you think your best battles fought in Kentucky?
Well, I'd say the best battle for our side was Sacramento. That's, of course, when old Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest run about 400 Yankees out of that town. We had a hard time at Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, and
That's Tennessee.
of course,
I won't hold those against you.
Battle of Mill Springs, we had our problems with them old
had your
flintlocks, and them Yankees had their percussion firearms, so we didn't do so well in the state of Kentucky.
Whoop. Thing sure makes funny noises. Well, I guess our best battle would have to be the biggest battle ever fought in Kentucky. It would be Perryville. Now,
When
we
you hear
had
you
some,
folks has got pushed back a
we
mile and
had
a
some
half?
problems. Now, I'll grant that. Now, no battle is easy, but the end result of the battle was that another great Confederate military genius, Braxton Bragg, had to withdraw from the state and ended forever the Confederates' hope of ever capturing Kentucky. Well, that was, without doubt, our greatest success.
Well, I won't deny that. You see, we had our problems with old Braxton Bragg. I heard these two ladies down in Murfreesboro was talking about him one day, and they said that they wished for the good of the Confederacy that old Bragg would die and go to heaven. Another remark to him said...
He's the best general in the Union Army, that's true.
Another remark to him said that wouldn't do no good, because when old General Bragg was right on the gates of heaven, at a critical moment, he'd fall back for a better position.
Sounds like him. Sounds like him. Did it at Munfordville. Went up to Bardstown.
Well, I think you
Well, he was falling sideways to a better position then.
Well, I think what he had in mind at that point was he wanted to inaugurate Richard Hawes as Kentucky's second provisional governor.
That worked out real well for him, too. Right here in Frankfort.
Old Richard Hawes standing there with his arm up, being sworn in as Confederate governor, and tack on if them Yankees didn't start shelling the city of Frankfort.
Sure did.
Kind of cut the festivities a bit short.
They were uninvited guests to the inaugural ball, is what we were. Right here in Frankfort, yeah, they were right out in front of the old Capitol out there, having the ceremonies, and all of a sudden the shelling started. Boom!
Well, you see, old Bragg, he figured that if the Yankee army was right outside of Frankfort, then he'd call in all his forces scattered throughout Kentucky, and we'd fight the big battle right here near Frankfort. Of course, old General Bragg was deluded as to the whereabouts of the Yankee army. You see, there's only one division of them outside of Frankfort under Colonel Seal.
General Bragg was usually somewhat deluded.
The main Yankee army was about 65 miles southwest of Perryville.
That was in it.
Of course, our general down there was General Polk, and he opened up Bragg's orders expressing his desire to brush away what Yankee resistance was in his front. And he opened up them battle lines on the 8th day of October of 1862, and we pushed the Yankees back about a mile and a half on the right flank, and then our cavalry come in and told us that they was outnumbered about 40,000 to 16,000.
We were somewhere between 40 and 60,000.
Well, whatever it was, it sure wasn't
Your cavalry's usually about 20,000 off, but that's all right.
Anyway, of course, under cover of darkness that night, old General Bragg once more gave us orders to withdraw.
As was his habit.
Well, they sent us down to a place called Stones River down in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and of course the Yankees done followed us down there too. Last day of 62 and the first 2 days of 63, we fought another big battle there at Stones River. And of course, now the Kentucky Brigade to which I was attached to, that's the 1st Kentucky Brigade under General Breckinridge. We was thrown out on the right flank. You see, there was a big hill off to the side there, and the Yankees was using their field glasses and watching our movements and such. And General Bragg gave Breckinridge orders to knock these Yankees off the hill, and he called out the whole Kentucky Brigade to do so. There was about 5,000 of us. The infantry got the orders to fix the bayonets and charge, and they charged up this hill. Them Yankees started jumping off of it like fleas off a dog's back and running like scared rabbits. And we chased them about 2 miles and had the best time of the war running and gunning and shooting them Yankees in the back. And then all of a sudden they jumped behind some breastworks, you see, and moved the brush out of the way, and we realized we'd done fallen into a trap. See, we was looking down the muzzles of 60 Yankee cannons. Well, they opened up on us with the solid shot and the canister and the grape shot and the exploding shot. In less than 20 minutes, we lost over 1,500 soldiers. Each one of them was Kentucky born. Well, this one old fellow was involved in that charge, this infantry soldier. He had his gun in his hands. He's running toward them Yankee lines. And well, along come one of them Yankee solid shots that tore off the poor fellow's leg. Of course, he wasn't no good for the charge no more. And he laid there in the grass and watched the rest of the brigade go up and meet the Yankee guns. And he started drifting back across the land he just covered. Just one fellow's laying there with his leg shot off, and he's screaming and yelling, "Please, somebody help me. The Yankees done shot my leg off. They're going to let me lay here and bleed to death." Finally, one boy heard him, and he picked him up, threw him across his shoulder, and started going back toward the rebel lines with him. And well, along come another one of them Yankee solid shots, and it took off the poor fellow's head. But the boy that was carrying him, you see, didn't realize what had happened. And he carried him on back to the lines, and finally one old soldier come up to me and says, "What are you doing carrying that dead man? He's had his head shot off." And they picked him up off his shoulder, looked at him, and he says, "Well, that lying scoundrel, he told me it was his leg."
There ain't no way to follow that one up.
Of course, after the Battle of Stones River, we went into what we call winter quarters at a place called Tullahoma, Tennessee. And I guess the biggest battle that occurred down there would be about 3rd day of April of 1863. See, we'd gone to bed that night just like everything else and woke up the next morning with about 6 inches of snow on the ground. Of course, there weren't no Yankees within miles, and some of the boys of the Kentucky regiment, they started throwing snowballs at some of the boys in the Tennessee regiment. And pretty soon the whole brigade got involved. And
I was trying to picture the date of this, when this great battle you were talking about was. I didn't remember that.
Anyway, it turned out to be the Tennessee brigade against the Kentucky brigade. And officers even came out and started giving orders and things. They made real good targets on top of them horses.
I bet they did.
But they finally had to call off the engagement around noon that afternoon on account of the total number of casualties that had been sustained. It seems like one of them snowballs had a rock or something inside, you see.
You rebels even have to cheat in a snowball fight, don't you? I mean...
Yeah. There ain't no cheating involved in this, Billy.
Always talking about great cavaliers, nobles of the South, but you've got your dirty tricks, too.
Let's take this call right here.
All right, sir.
We'll get back to the snowballs. Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to ask Sergeant Hughes why he has one more stripe than Sergeant Hall.
Okay, why do you have one more stripe than Sergeant Hall?
Well, I'm just one stripe smarter than he is. No, the one stripe indicates a quartermaster sergeant, where he's just a plain basic sergeant.
So what it amounts to is this Billy spends most of his time behind the lines, and folks I run around with up their own.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Well,
He
anyway,
also serves who stands and waits.
what I was going to tell them about Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Of course, this was early in 62.
Yeah, that's early in the war.
Of course, after the Yankees done hit us at down in Monticello at the Battle of Mill Springs, about 10 days after that, some Yankee forces commanded by this fellow named James A. Garfield out of Ohio, they come and hit us.
Think he'll ever amount to anything?
If he's a Billy, he won't amount to much.
No, he might have promise.
Anyway, once again at the Battle of Miller Creek, them Yankees had them percussion firearms and things, and our boys had these old smooth bores and flintlocks, and they just wasn't no match for them, and they got pushed on back through Pound Gap into Virginia. Of course, we done ordered all these percussion firearms and things, and didn't have no problem at all shipping through the Yankee blockade.
Had a little trouble paying for them, but
That don't matter neither. Anyway, took a while to get the arms, you see, from the Confederate ports up to the armies in the field. Of course, by the time they got them,
all
they
your
done lost them.
railroads run the wrong way.
Yeah, well, they was run the right way. They just running too good at all. Anyway, time our armies got these percussion firearms and things, the Yankees done control eastern Kentucky. Of course, now you give them Yankees an inch, they're going to take a mile, and the next thing they want to do is take over central Kentucky. So this time that Lincoln fella, he sends after us this fellow named Eads and his gunboat fleet. Now this Eads fellow was the guy that made the first bridge across the Mississippi River, and he come out with this gunboat fleet made of ironclads. They named them all for cities on the river systems, the Louisville, the Cincinnati, and the Carondelet, and the Mound City. They come down the Tennessee River and they hit us at Fort Henry. And I reckon what the problem was at Fort Henry is that the officer that laid that fort out must have been under some kind of intoxicant at the time. You see, the fort was lying so low and the river itself was rising, and while the battle was going on, the water was coming over the sides of the fort. Our gunners
Your engineers are as good as your generals, there's no doubt about it.
Well, of course, the gunners were standing there trying to fight off these daggone Yankees in gunboats standing knee-deep in water. And now the colonel in charge, he realized it's kind of foolish to try to maintain a fortification. It was going to flood out anyway, so
That was
he asked
Tillman,
for...
wasn't it?
Let's see, who was in charge? Yeah, General
Lloyd Tillman.
Lloyd Tillman, yeah. He was colonel at the time. Anyway, he figured it's kind of senseless to try to maintain a fortification that's going to flood out anyway, so he'd asked for 15 volunteers, and they tried to hold off the Yankee gunboats while the rest of the garrison went across the land bridge over to Fort Donelson.
Okay, let's take this call here. Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to know if the uniforms are authentic, and would you tell us something about them?
Well, mine was issued to me from the state arsenal about 3 weeks ago from the... no. Do we do that in or out?
Anyway.
Okay, yes. To get out of character for a minute, the uniforms are modern reproductions. They are as authentic as we can make them. We think we could issue them to a Union or a Confederate soldier, and we'd probably deceive him as to whether he was getting a uniform 120 years old or not. There are several companies around the country that specialize in making them now. These particular ones, for the most part, came from a company in Corinth, Mississippi.
My uniform is Confederate artillery, ma'am. You can tell the service somebody's in by the color trim on the uniform. Our Billy here is in the infantry with his blue trim, and I'm in the artillery with the red, and of course them cavalrymen would be trimmed in yellow. Anyway, after the fall of Fort Henry,
Back to the war.
Yankees turned the gunboats around.
I particularly like the boots, actually.
Yankees turned the gunboats around the Tennessee River, and they go back up the Ohio, where went north on the Ohio and come down the Cumberland River. And they tried to do the same thing to us there at Fort Donelson, but Fort Donelson turned out to be much tough enough for them Yankees to crack, you see. That the gunboats come down the river just like they did there at Henry, but this time our boys knocked out them Yankee gunboats and even injured the Yankee gunboat commander. I believe his name was Andrew Hullfoot, flag officer. Of course, now that the Yankee gunboats had been knocked out, it brought in the need for Yankee land forces, and once again they was commanded by this fellow out of Illinois, this U.S. Grant fellow. Well, just about a month before that, he jumped across the Mississippi River and tried to surprise some of our boys at Belmont. Surprise was on General Grant, though, because he got whooped pretty good.
You love this story, don't you?
The only problem with old General Grant was I reckon he just didn't know how to stay whooped. Anyway, they circled us there at Fort Donelson. Although we tried to break out on the road to Nashville, we was unsuccessful in doing it. Although Colonel Forrest did get out about 2,000 cavalry troopers. Of course, the next day, Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner was forced to surrender somewhere around 12,500 Confederate soldiers.
Now, you're passing up a wonderful little scene in Confederate history there where the generals commanding the fort sit around and the top-ranking general says to the next-ranking general, you surrender. And he says to the next-ranking general, I'm too important, I'll leave, you surrender. And this went all down the ranks till finally poor General Buckner was stuck with it. He was probably the best general they had.
Well, you figure the quality of the two generals in charge, Gideon Pillow and General Floyd. He was, of course, Secretary of War under Buchanan. Didn't think too much of either one of them myself. You got a call there, sir?
Yeah, let's take this call right here. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, I have to correct my comrade, Sergeant Hall, on one small point about the uniforms. I believe all Billy uniforms are trimmed in yellow.
All what now?
All Billy uniforms are trimmed in yellow. He may have a point there.
Okay, thank you for calling.
Well, anyway, of course, like I say, we had to surrender about 12,000 troops there at Fort Donelson. And, of course, now, this was the first big Yankee victory in the war. And, of course, as you might suspect, they was all happy and joyful from it all. But so much so that I read out of one of them Yankee newspapers out of Chicago said that they were so happy about the fall of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson that anybody found in the streets of Chicago after 10 o'clock at night that was still sober would be arrested as a secessionist.
Sounds like an excellent idea.
Anyway, the forces I was with over at Bowling Green, as well as Polk's boys at Columbus, we got orders to withdraw down through Tennessee, and we stopped down a place called Corinth, Mississippi. You see, there's a north-south and an east-west rail line there, and we figured...
Wait a minute. This little withdrawal happened to cross all the way across Tennessee?
That's what our orders were, yeah.
That's a mighty little withdrawal, don't you think? You don't mention to the people that you ran off and left Nashville, which you hadn't taken any precautions to defend, and you left piles and piles of what little food and supplies you had laying there.
Well, like I say, you Yankees was controlling the river, and if we didn't get out of there, you're going to bring your gunboats down there anyway.
Well, you got to stand and fight, you courageous boys of the South.
Well, you see, what we figured we'd do is go on down to Corinth, Mississippi. You Yankees would stick your neck out so far, we could just cut it right off.
Didn't quite work that way, though, did it?
Well, just about did.
Not
You
quite.
see, our boys was down there at Corinth, and like I say, there was a north-south and east-west rail line there. We brought in troops from all over the Confederacy to push these daggone Yankees back where they come from. Anyway, General Grant was down there with his 35,000 Yankee troops at a place called Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. And he was just waiting for another Yankee general by the name of Don Carlos Buell, who was marching with 35,000 more from Nashville. Of course, them Yankees figured they put these two armies together and they come hit us at Corinth. Now, of course, our general, Albert City Johnson, he realized there wasn't going to be no problem at all to whip one Yankee army, but it might be kind of hard to whip two of them at once. So we decided to hit General Grant before this Buell fellow arrived. Well, about 6 o'clock in the morning on April 6th of 1862, we marched out in 3 different lines of battle, and each one of them was 4 miles long from end to end. And we crashed on into them Yankee camps. Now, here's General Grant, I'll tell you up and down, that he wasn't surprised there at Shiloh. But if he does that, I want you to ask him yourself, how come so many of his boys were shot and bayoneted in the tents while they slept? And how come so many of our boys had the first hot meal they'd had in days, because when the Yankees run from the camps, they left hot food for us on the fire. And we pushed them back on the right flank.
That's usually how you get hot meals, is stealing them, isn't it?
You talk about abandoning things, Yankee. You always want to run this time. Anyway, we pushed them on the right flank and pushed them on the left, but the center was holding kind of strong, a place they called the Sunken Road. And they soon gave it a new name, started calling it the Hornet's Nest, you see, because bullets was buzzing around the head so fast and furious, it kind of sounded like bees was buzzing. Well, this one old boy in my brigade, he was in the 4th Kentucky. He said every time he stood up and fired into the Yankee lines, he felt like the whole Yankee army was standing up and shooting back at him. And his mother wrote and told him, and said, well, son, why don't you find yourself a tree or something to hide behind? And he wrote back and told us, this bomb, just wasn't enough trees there for the officers to hide behind, let alone the men.
I know the feeling.
Anyway, General Johnson gave us orders to make one last charge that day, and we charged them Yankees at the Hornet's Nest and captured about 2,200 of them in prisoner. We paid a right deal price for it,
Yeah,
though,
you
you see,
did.
because old General Johnson took a bullet through his leg and
General
cut the artery.
Johnson, he didn't play his cards very well that day.
Well, he
Sat
had-
on his horse with a bullet in his leg, as I understand it, until he bled to death.
Had a tourniquet in his pocket. If he would have just put it
Never
on, it would have
put it
saved his
on.
life. Anyway, the command then fell on the shoulders of General Beauregard. And he figured you Yankees done been pretty well whooped that day, and he told us to rest on arms that night. We finished them off first thing in the morning. But unknown to us that night, that Yankee General Buell arrived with his 35,000 Yankee soldiers, and we woke up the next morning facing twice as many Yankees as we'd done the day before. Well, old General Beauregard, figuring discretion being the better part of valor, he gave us orders to withdraw back toward Corinth. Now, the Yankee that was in charge of this Western Department at the time was a fellow named Henry Halleck, who had not been at the Battle of Shiloh.
Stop right there for a minute.
all right,
Let's take, this is a telephone. I know you all haven't never seen
I was wondering what this thing was.
Now, you just listen.
Let's get all those little people in there.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I just turned your program on, and I was wondering if either one of you are familiar with any of the battles here in Frankfort, especially on top of the Fort Hill area, where they had a fortress years ago.
Yeah. We can tell you a little bit about that. What happened was, we talked briefly a minute ago about how the Confederates occupied Frankfort in 1862, and they more or less just marched in. The people of Frankfort decided that that was a little too easy. So what they did was dug a fort called Fort Boone along the crest of Fort Hill. It wasn't called Fort Hill till then, although I think there was a fort there in the pioneer period. The federal engineers came in and inspected the fort and said, no, this will never do. You're going to have to do better. So they started building another fort right on the crest of the hill, which they call the New Redoubt. And it was going to be a really powerful, impressive, large fort. Well, it was in 1864, when they were still working on the second fort, that a company of John Hunt Morgan's men attacked Frankfort. Part of them attacked up the back of Fort Hill. Some of them came across on the side from Louisville, and some came down through the cemetery. The Home Guard and the loyal troops that were in town turned out, and most of them went up to the fort, Fort Boone, the first one they had built. The workers that were working on the New Redoubt, most of them were black, and they started running back to the fort that was finished because they didn't want to be anywhere near where the Confederates were. But the adjutant general, he rode up, headed them off halfway between the two forts, and sent them back down the road to Frankfort. He says, you don't want to go in that fort. He says, if these Confederates capture this fort with you in it, you're all dead. He said, there's no reason for that to happen. So y'all go on down back to town, which they did. The Confederates attacked the fort, and they fought there for several hours. And, there weren't very many casualties, like 3 or 4 on either side, something like that. They also, they had 2 20-pounder Parrot guns up there that fired at the Confederates on the other side of the river that were trying to come across the covered bridge, and fought them off. They rolled another gun into the lawn of the arsenal and fired at the Confederates with it. So the Confederates sent some riflemen right across the river from the arsenal and started shooting at the gun crew. And as the bullets come whizzing by the gunners, they again exercised the better part of valor and went back inside the arsenal until the battle was over. And when the Confederates started to leave, they ran back out and manned the cannon again and fired at them until they were out of sight. And that was pretty much the...
Well, you Yankees are good at shooting people in the back.
Well, you admitted to it a few minutes ago.
Is there another question, sir?
No, thank you very much.
All right.
Well, I was talking about that Shiloh battle. Like I say, after the battle was over with, the Yankee that was in charge of what they call the Western Department was a fellow named Henry Halleck, who the Yankees referred to as Old Brains. Mm-hmm. Of course, he was real upset with General Grant for being surprised there at Shiloh, so he come down to Pittsburgh land to take personal charge of the assault on Corinth. Now, it's only 20 miles from Pittsburgh land to Corinth, but it took them Yankees 6 weeks to get there.
I'll even admit that's a little slow.
See, the problem was they had them so scared that they were going to be attacked and all that the Yankees would go out and pull out the picks and shovels and advance a half a mile and dig trenches. And they pull out the picks and shovels again and advance another half a mile and dig trenches. Well, no wonder it took them 6 weeks to go 20 miles. They tried to tunnel the whole way. Well,
now, you find a lot of these Confederate tunnels between Chattanooga and Atlanta, too. Y'all just took a little longer to learn to do that.
Well, while them Yankees were busy doing the picks and shovel work, we swung around the flank and started on that great invasion we was talking about in 1862. Of course, that culminated in the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, and also the Battle of Perryville.
Also the Battle of Perryville, yeah.
Anyway, we done talked about the Perryville campaign a little bit. Got as far as Tullahoma, middle of 63.
With your snowball fight.
And the Yankees, of course, they tried to take over Chattanooga, you see. And they decided they was going to outflank us and outfox us there. And old General Rosecrans thought he had done so. And, well, the problem was he got caught in a place called Chickamauga Creek, about 15 miles below Chattanooga. Now, Chickamauga is an Indian word. Means river of blood, as I understand it. It's probably well named, because there's got a lot of Yankee blood running around through Chickamauga Creek.
You passed right over, what was that battle? Lookout Mountain down there, Chattanooga?
Now, that was after Chickamauga.
Yeah, but you're going to tell them about how you lost your cannons there, aren't you?
Well, we was with Cobbs Battery at the time. You see, Major Gray's been killed at the Battle of Stones River, at the Battle of Chickamauga, excuse me. And after that battle, Gray's Battery was consolidated into Cobbs. We were up there right near Bragg's headquarters, and tack on if that General Bragg didn't order the Kentucky infantry away from Cobbs Battery. It'd be the first time in the war that we ain't been supported by our own infantry, and we was up there with General Bates' Florida boys. And tack on, Yankees started coming up this hill, and we figured we had them right where we wanted them, and all of a sudden our infantry supports, they just melted to the rear. So tack on Florida troops. Well, of course, we was up there facing all kinds of Yankees, and all we had was hand spikes and a few revolvers, maybe. And we just couldn't hold back 7 or 8 regiments of Yankees. And
that was difficult even for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It's the only time in the war we lost our guns. We had to retreat off of that one, I'm afraid. We had a couple of pet cannons we had. They called them Lady Breckenridge and Lady Buckner. We done lost them there. Of course, we just got us a couple more cannons from all those we captured down at Chickamauga, and they switched us over to rifled Parrots.
So now you're going to tell me you came out better on this deal.
Well, it depends on how you look at it. The Parrot, of course, is a much more accurate cannon at distance and all, but as far as you Yankees charging guns and things, I'd rather have a Napoleon. Loaded up with triple canister shot, and you knock out 40 you Yankees in one shot.
You could indeed. You could indeed. Whew. How many candles they got in those things?
Quite a few.
We didn't tell the lady a while ago about these uniforms. They're wool from head to toe. And this particular one is all quilted on the inside to give you a nice, robust military image. It gets a little warm in these in July and August when you're marching 20 miles a day.
Yeah, well, that's what you infantry boys are used to. Of course, our artillery boys, we either jump on a horse or jump on a caisson or something. We just ride. That's why I joined the infantry. I never did think too much of artillery. I didn't think too much of marching.
We got a precedent.
Yeah, we got a couple of questions here that came in, and I'd like to get your viewpoints on this. About how many soldiers from Kentucky fought on each side?
Roughly 40,000 Confederate and probably about 80,000 Yankee, I believe.
80 to 100,000. If you count the black troops and all the home guard and state troops for the Union.
See, it's real hard to answer that question because when the war broke out, Kentucky had declared itself neutral. And a lot of boys, both north and south, went across the Kentucky borders and joined regiments from either Tennessee, Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois. So they was Kentuckians, but they were actually an out-of-state regiment. So it's kind of hard to say how many Kentucky troops actually fought.
Yeah, but it's probably about 2 to 1 Union to Confederate.
That'd be about right.
Which most people, I don't think, really realized that there was that many more Union soldiers from the state.
I didn't realize that myself. I thought it was just about 50-50.
No, it was a much more loyal state than people think.
Loyal to who?
To the United States, sir.
Okay.
Matter of opinion, you say.
Another question that came in, how does one get into the reenactments that you all do?
Well, it just so happens that both of us are into that. You can contact either one of us here at the Historical Society, and we'd, of course, be willing to give you all information about that. Kentucky Historical Society. It'd be Post Office Box H, as in history, Frankfort, Kentucky, 40601. Just address it either Sergeant Hall or Sergeant Hughes. Depends on which point of view you're going to take.
The Military Museum sponsors a Union infantry company, the 7th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry. We supply a reproduction rifle for use with that. You have to purchase your own uniform, though, which is a couple $100.
It said, another question was called in. It says, I would like each soldier to comment on the value of J.H. Morgan.
Horse thief. Ought to be hung. His only value is that he keeps a lot of good soldiers that could be off shooting the likes of him standing around Kentucky waiting for him to attack again. He's nothing but a horse thief.
Well, that's where the advantage of the man lies. You see, he'd go out on one of his raids and he'd tie up 8,000 Yankees at one time, and they'd be too busy chasing down his 400 men.
Okay, we got a call here. Let's take this. Yes, go ahead.
I wanted to hear about some of the black people that fought in that war.
Okay. Can you tell us about some of the black people fought in that war?
There were a surprisingly large number, especially, well, almost entirely, of course, on the Union side. There was a long, long controversy before black troops were even allowed to fight in the war at all.
Mostly was used as teamsters and things in the other part of the war.
Yeah, for the main part of the war, they drove the wagon teams and did construction work and that sort of thing. Finally, they experimented in the Carolinas and then Louisiana with a few regiments. And finally, well, there was pressure from abolitionists and from some northern states. And frankly, the Union just needed the manpower was the main thing that got it going.
They needed all the help they could get, you see.
They formed quite a number of black Union regiments from all the northern states.
As I understand it, Kentucky had the second most number of black troops in the war, second to Louisiana.
To Louisiana, I think so.
I reckon the reason for that was because so many blacks were escaping slavery down south, they had to come through Kentucky, you see, to get north. By the time they got here, they decided to stop and join the Yankee regiments.
And then Kentucky was under a military government of the Federal Army for most of the war, and the military commanders would offer freedom to slaves if they would enlist in the Army, which was a pretty good incentive to enlist.
Okay, now we was on this J.H. Morgan. You got any more to say?
Well, of course, General Morgan, he and his men were responsible for causing a lot of commotion here in Kentucky, but I guess really that's about all it really did cause, because there wasn't any significant effects from Morgan's raids into Kentucky. I mean, they did a lot of damage, especially to military stores and things, but they really didn't have any effect on the troops in the field.
Okay, let's get this one. Yes, go ahead.
Sergeant Hughes, tell me something. How can you fire a gun with your eyes as cross-eyed as your glasses appear to be?
Well, now you got to remember he was in the quartermasters, I believe.
That's why I'm in the quartermaster.
That may be one reason why he ain't shot me yet.
I can hold the forms up right here and fill it out very well. No problems at all.
Well, now, do you wear glasses? I mean, are those actually glasses that you?
Oh yes.
You do wear glasses, and
I don't wear these every day.
yeah, but I mean, they're not just plain glass.
Oh no. No,
They
not at all.
Well, I can see why you're in the quartermasters now.
Of course.
I'd like to go into a little more on this Kentucky part of it. You were talking about where the colored people was coming up to Kentucky and joining in. How big of a part of Kentucky was this Underground Railroad?
Well, that was before the war, and I'm not really...
Or wasn't the Underground Railroad also?
Yeah, as I understand
It passed through this area,
here, but I really don't know how it worked or who was involved or anything.
There was a lot of people around like Meade County that were involved in that. They transported a lot of them there across into Indiana. But it's really, I really don't know much about the Underground Railroad here in Kentucky. There was a lot of points here, and of course a lot of slaves passed through this area. But
here comes another bulletin. I have a feeling this is going to be a good one.
Well, you said something about that they would stop here in Kentucky and join the Union.
yeah, that was during the war.
Yeah, during the war. And you also made a statement. Was the North short of manpower at that time when
late in the war.
I think you made a statement that this helped?
They had far, far more men than the Confederacy, but still the demands were so great that...
They had too many of them were too chicken to fight, you see.
Now.
They had to start drafting them. As a matter of fact, in the summer of '63, there was a couple of regiments that were earmarked to go to Gettysburg. Of course, they had to drag them out of there and send them to New York to put down the draft rides.
Yeah, draft rides are nothing new in American experience. there were in the Civil War. Of course, you could buy substitutes then. If you didn't want to join the Army, you could pay somebody else to do it for you.
Yeah, that was the Union. Could you do that in the Confederates also?
No, sir. The only way you could get out if you were in the Confederacy was to be a doctor or maybe a teacher or an overseer with more than 40 slaves. It's kind of hard to get out of it, the Southern Confederacy.
There's a question here. I don't know if this is true or not. Is it true that when President Davis was captured, he was wearing a dress? Did he enjoy it?
Of course,
I'll let our Confederate ally adversary respond to that.
Sounds like Klinger on MASH.
well, I think what you got there, you see, is some Yankee newspaper reporter blowing facts out of proportion. You see what happened during the capture of Mr. Davis back in, I believe it was Irwinville, Georgia, is that what it was? He was down there, and he and his wife were together, and it had been raining that day he was captured, and he ran out of the tent, and he put on his wife's shawl. It was kind of like a raincoat, and that's all they had on, but you see there was some Yankee newspaperman there, and of course them newspapers, especially Yankee newspapers, they used to blowing things out of proportion.
At least we've got newspaper.
Anyway, he was not wearing a dress at the time. Like I say, he only had on his wife's shawl, and it's just a story that got blown all out of proportion.
That was just a malicious story that was put around.
I don't know where these questions are coming from. Is it true that on the eve of the Battle of Paris, the Union general and the Confederate general, I won't mention the name, slept together?
There is no truth to that rumor.
I never heard that myself.
I've heard that rumor, but no.
Is there anything in
Some people say that they both behaved so stupidly in the course of the day that they must have been good friends, and that some people, I've even heard that they were somehow related, and they got there was some family connection, and the night before the battle they met between the armies and slept in the same house, and then early in the morning split and went back and fought the battle, but there's absolutely no truth to it at all. It's just one of the many silly stories that came out of the war.
Well, let me ask you this. I know they have the action in the field, so to speak, of the Confederate Unions, some battle scenes or something like that. Do y'all participate in those? And,
right.
How do you actually work those? Do the Yankees slip up on the Confederates or something like that?
No, usually things are pretty well planned in advance.
They don't want to get people hurt, you see.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the safety is a primary importance in this sort of situation. So most of these things are all scheduled out, and all the movements of the troops in the field are pre-designated.
There'll be an officer's call the morning before the battle, and they'll get out and actually draw out on a board a lot of times. This unit will do this. It's just like planning a real battle, only both sides are there, so that nobody gets hurt in the course of the thing. And then, of course, once it's underway, the officers that are in the field with the units are responsible for making sure, just like originally, that everything goes as the plan calls for, and that people get shot and take casualties when you're supposed to, and all that sort of thing.
In other words, it's just planned out. This is just no one man, so to speak, rush at each other or something like that.
In fact,
too much chance of somebody getting hurt that way, you see.
There's never any hand-to-hand type combat, or at least very rarely, unless it's planned and rehearsed even in advance. Most events won't allow that sort of thing unless the people that are going to do it before the battle actually go out before the crowd gets there, and just like a rehearsal for a play.
Well, we had a couple of questions on the blacks, where there's talking about the history of the blacks. Do either one of you know what was the highest ranking officer, say, of a black person?
Sergeant. See, there were no black officers.
Late in the war, there were a few, but I don't know. They weren't over the company grade.
I never heard of any black officers. I heard that all the black regiments had white officers, and sergeant would be the highest ranking that a black soldier would have. Well, that's information. Now, of course, there were no blacks in Confederate service. They were authorized to be so, but they weren't authorized until March of 1865, and of course the war ended in April of 65, so they didn't get in.
Okay. Here's one that says, I got a couple here. It says, why do you suppose so many people today claim that their granddaddies and great-granddaddies fought for the South when twice as many actually fought for the North?
In Kentucky, the military government during the war and then occupation during Reconstruction was just so brutal to the state, and the people that managed it just got so completely out of control that it just gave the Union cause a bad image in the state for the next 100 years, and people have never gotten over it. There is a theory that something might have happened in the war that made Union soldiers have difficulty having children. I've sometimes wondered when you go out, because you never find anybody, or very rarely, that'll claim ancestry of a Union enlisted man particularly.
Most of them just ashamed of the ancestry.
I guess that's it.
Yeah. Another part of this, could you comment on guerrilla activities?
Well, guerrillas to begin with were folks that had been in one army to the other but decided to desert the army for whatever reasons and make war on innocent civilians. And the guerrilla activity in Kentucky was pretty rough. Of course, one old fellow was named William Clark Quantrell out of Missouri, and some of the boys that fought with him, like Cole and Bobby Younger and Frank and Jesse James. Then there was another fellow named Jerome Clark here in Kentucky. He was actually started out as a member of Cobbs Battery, but he was also known as
good company, don't you?
He was also known as Sue Monday. You see, he had real feminine features, and oftentimes he would dress up in the clothing of a lady and walk up to them Yankee officers and find out where the troops was. And of course, when he found out, he'd go hit them where they was the weakest. Took the Yankees about a year and a half to figure out what was happening, but of course you figure on Yankee methods of thinking and all, it's probably about right on time. Well, they finally did catch up with him one day out of Brandenburg, Kentucky, where they took him to Louisville and put him on trial. And well, that afternoon he received what you might call true Yankee justice, as he could be seen swinging from a tree in downtown Louisville.
Okay, let's see if we can get this started. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I just wondered if the gentleman knew which the first skirmish in Kentucky took place, whereabouts?
Okay.
I believe was that
September the 19th.
Camp Wildcat?
Wildcat Mountain.
Yeah.
What about in Barberville, Kentucky? First skirmish took place in Barberville, Kentucky.
I don't know about those skirmishes. I thought it was either Wildcat Mountain or possibly Sacramento.
Bridge at Barberville Bridge took place on September the 19th, 1861. At a little place right in the city of Barberville.
I myself not familiar with it. It must have been some of Zollicoffer's boys.
I don't know which one that particularly was.
Where Camp Andy Johnson was.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you all knew that.
Yeah. No, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of skirmishes and small battles all over the state.
There's 428 of them in the state.
Okay. And usually the one that is recognized as the first battle of any real significance was Camp Wildcat, which is, Mount Vernon, London,
Well,
south
it's somewhere down there, some say.
Well, it was all about the same time.
Yeah.
At that time, when Zollicoffer came through.
Right.
Really? Okay. Thank you.
All right, thanks for calling. You were talking about Quantrell and Sue Monday.
Yes, sir. Well, Quantrell came in from Missouri, and of course they made a few guerrilla raids here in Kentucky, and they finally captured him and killed him. But they didn't get rid of all of his boys. Like I say, Frank and Jesse James were involved in that, and of course, whatever happened to them after the war is probably history too. But guerrilla activities are really rough here in Kentucky, and it caused a lot of repressive measures by what they call the Home Guard. And it really created a lot of animosities here that would last long after the war was over.
That's what brought on all the roughness of the federal occupation, was trying to put down this guerrilla activity. And people would write to the governor and say the guerrillas are burning and pillaging the county, send troops in to help. And 6 months later, the same people would be writing back saying the troops are burning and pillaging the county. You know, there's bad guerrillas.
Send guerrillas.
Send the guerrillas, yeah.
One quick question, because we only have about 2 or 3 more minutes. Carpetbaggers, what can you tell us about them?
I don't know nothing about that.
That's after the war.
Well, that was after the war. I mean, you all lived after the war. Can you tell us anything about the
just they were just fine Union fellas that wanted to go down south, turn a little profit in the traditional American free enterprise way. No, they were evidently took advantage of the chaos in the South to make a fast buck. Basically what happened.
And Red Butler's all right. Just
I don't know him. The only Butler I can think of is Ben Butler. Of course, he's a real scandal.
Beast
from
Butler?
Yeah, Beast Butler. He's the one that had trouble with all them ladies down in New Orleans.
In fact, he was one of the first men to organize a black regiment we were talking about earlier, General Butler. But Rhett Butler...
You never heard of Red Butler and Gone with the Wind?
Who'd he fight with?
Gone with the Wind. Well, I think he stayed out of it.
Sounds like a carpetbagger.
I think Red Butler stayed out of it. Well, gentlemen, our time has run out. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned some Kentucky history that I didn't know about, and I'm sure our audience have too. I'm hoping that maybe some other time that we can have you on some more battles. One other quick question. What was the most important battle that turned the whole tide of the war?
Gettysburg, I guess. That's what everybody...
Well, I would admit that it was at that time period. I don't know if it was Gettysburg as much as it might have been Vicksburg. Of course, with the fall of Vicksburg, you see, it gave the Yankees control of the Mississippi River and it cut the Confederacy in half. So I think Vicksburg was more important than Gettysburg.
And the two right on top of each other was just too much.
Let's see if we can take a quick question here. We got about a minute. Yes, go ahead.
Hello?
Yes.
Is this 227-4480?
Yes.
Hello?
Go ahead.
I just want to tell you how wonderful I think your program is.
Well, thank you. We appreciate it.
I really think it is marvelous. I am a true Southerner. My people were always Southerners. We're very proud of the fact that we were. They fought in the Revolution. They fought in the Civil War. My background goes back to 1242 in France. On my father's side, I cannot divulge my name because of political things. But I just want to tell you how wonderful I think this program is. You're a little bit mixed up on some of your details, but it is marvelous. And I appreciate it so much, and I think we ought to have more of it.
All right. Thank you, Mr.